Hello everyone and welcome to the American Indian and Alaska Native Behavioral Health webinar series. I am Kate Trams and today we welcomed Dr. Peter Nathan to give us insight and instruction on the DSM-5. I do want to mention that we have just had a fire alarm going off here in our building. Before we got started, it has just been announced that it has been cleared, but I just want to warn you in case any other alarms go off. We will continue as we can, and we likely will not have to evacuate. It seems like everything is taken care of at this point. So thank you for your patience. This training series is brought to you by the National American Indian and Alaska Native Addiction Technology Transfer Center. We are one of 4 national focus centers serving the ATTC network, which also includes 10 regional centers and a network coordinating office. To learn more about the ATTC network, please visit our website. Coming up in April, we will have a session on the impact of colonization on Native communities, led by Nazba Tom. And for our Essential Substance Abuse Skills webinar series, on March 16, Lenny Hayes will present Basic Counseling Skills. We hope you'll be able to join us for these upcoming webinars. Our center is a NADAC certified educational provider, and we'd be happy to provide you with CEHs for a $15 fee. The request form is available for download in the Files pod in the webinar screen, and will also be sent in a follow-up email to all who attended. Immediately following today's webinar, you'll be redirected to our GIPRA evaluation. This survey asks about your satisfaction with the event and will take less than 10 minutes to complete. We thank you in advance for helping us to improve our programs. You will be muted for the duration of this webinar, so please use the Q&A pod to share your questions and comments, and we will address questions at appropriate points during the presentation. If you prefer, you may view the presentation in full screen mode by clicking on the full screen button at the top right corner of the presentation pod, which looks like 4 arrows pointing outward. To return to the regular view, click the button again. We would also like you to be aware that this webinar records participant attention time. If you minimize the webinar or are working in another window, the system will record your participation as inactive, which may be reflected in the number of CEHs received. The opinions expressed in this presentation are those of the presenter and do not necessarily reflect the official position of CSTAT, SAMHSA, or the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. Today's speaker is Dr. Peter Nathan. We are incredibly fortunate to have Dr. Nathan connected with our center to teach on the DSM-5 and many other aspects of behavioral health, as he is an extensively published author and happens to be a contributing editor to the DSM itself. He has received the Association of American Publishers Psychology Award for A Guide to Treatment That Works and the American Psychological Association Award as distinguished professional contributions to knowledge. Dr. Nathan is now a professor emeritus with the University of Iowa Foundation, and prior he maintained positions as professor in the Department of Community and Behavioral Health, College of Public Health, and as distinguished professor in the Department of Psychology. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nathan, and I will pass things over to him at this time.
Good morning, good afternoon, and welcome. Let me see if I have to. Okay, we're going to talk about DSM-5, which was published in May 2013. It's the standard diagnostic nomenclature for the United States and for a number of other countries in the Western Hemisphere. There is another nomenclature that is used elsewhere in the world, in Africa, many parts of Europe, Asia, and that's the ICD-10, the International Classification of Diseases, 10th edition. It's published by the World Health Organization, and it covers a full range of physical disorders as well as psychiatric disorders. The DSM only covers a full range of psychiatric disorders. The effort has been over the last 30 years to bring the DSM and the ICD into closer harmony and
Your
ultimately
microphone has been turned on.
single nomenclature for psychiatric disorders. It's the only, in this country, DSM 5 now is the only nomenclature recognized by third party payers. So if you want to be paid for what you do, you have to list DSM now, DSM 5 diagnoses. Now, the DSM has been around for quite a long time. The first edition was published in 1952. So that's a long time ago, and we've gone through a variety of changes in the DSM as psychology, psychiatry, social work have changed. And the DSM, to some extent, has reflected those changes. It came about in this way. It's an interesting history. In the mid 1920s, at a time when most psychiatric patients were living in state hospitals around the country. State hospitals were very large. New York State, for example, had a couple of state hospitals that had 5,000 or 6,000 patients. There wasn't any very effective treatment at that time, and the patients were very different from the patients that are seen nowadays, in that they were generally unmanageable outside of an institution. So they were often diagnosed with schizophrenia, manic depressive psychosis, other psychoses, including those focused on dementia, on depression and anxiety. There were many patients with dementia, and there were quite a number of patients with neurological disorders, including Alzheimer's dementia, including substance-related dementia, other kinds of dementia. The problem was there was no national nomenclature. So each hospital essentially developed its own system of diagnosis and nomenclature, and those systems differed from hospital to hospital. As a result, communication between mental health professionals about their patients was extremely difficult because there was no agreed upon set of symptoms for any of the most common disorders seen or housed at state hospitals. And this problem persisted till the late 30s, when several groups of mental health professionals began working together to try to develop a common nomenclature. Then along came the Second World War, and to the surprise of many, there were more soldiers disabled by substance abuse and psychosis and serious depression, anxiety, and the like than were disabled by combat. Very, very large numbers of patients, of soldiers, were diagnosed, and yet there was no system that enabled clinicians, military clinicians, predominantly psychiatrists and psychologists, to identify and diagnose ultimately treat these individuals. When the war was over, groups of clinicians from the American Psychiatric Association, the Veterans Administration, uh, and other important groups concerned with psychiatric patients got together and began creating a nomenclature. And the first one was published in 1952, second one in 1968, and all the way along to 2013. So that's a long history, and I'm going to just very briefly talk about a couple of these. The DSM-1 was the first national nomenclature, and it's interesting that it was written by a very small group of senior male psychiatrists working in prestigious settings. Um, there was one woman out of 28 individuals responsible for DSM. One woman, no people of color, no professionals other than psychiatrists. So it was a very limited, very elite group. They didn't use data. There were really no data on the prevalence and incidence of the mental disorders that were now going to be included in the DSM. The DSM nomenclature was very short. Only 120 conditions or disorders. And because the booklet that was published for DSM-1 was only about 120 pages, it was impossible to provide clinicians using it with enough information to diagnose reliably, meaning that those persons who began using the DSM diagnostic system didn't really very often agree with colleagues at other institutions, but this was a beginning to develop a common nomenclature. And the important thing was that these diagnoses were of both psychotic disorders and medical disorders that had psychiatric consequences, like Alzheimer's disease. And they included non-psychotic disorders, the kinds of disorders that rarely were found in the state hospitals around the United States. The War Department, the VA, American Psychiatric, began to develop DSM-1, and it was published in 1952, 7 years after the end of the Second World War. The DSM-1 and the DSM-2 were heavily influenced by psychoanalytic and psychological theory. So the first DSM-1, was heavily influenced by Meyerian psychodynamic theory, which assumed that psychiatric disorders arose from events early in life and fulminated in later on in life. So these two theories were not influenced by data. There were no data. Even in 1968, that was a notable time because the drugs for psychosis, specifically for schizophrenia, were developed in the late 50s and widely used in the 60s. As a result, the state hospitals began to empty out because these patients were given the phenothiazines, chlorpromazine, a whole variety of antipsychotic medication, which brought many of the patients into closer contact with reality, but also came along with a lot of serious side effects. The drafters of DSM-2, like the drafters of DSM-1, were largely male. Again, there was a single female psychiatrist involved, and they relied on their clinical experience rather than empirical data. As a result, again, diagnoses, both with using DSM-1 and DSM-2, were unreliable, meaning there was not agreement among clinicians who used these manuals to diagnose. Then along came DSM-3, and it was truly revolutionary. It increased the number of diagnoses included in the manual by 2.5 times, so that there were from about 120, close to 500 diagnoses included in DSM-3. Why is this so? I mean, there were many clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, who took offense at this development and felt that the psychiatric profession was trying to take over the enterprise of diagnosis. Psychiatric imperialism was a phrase that was widely used. And the drafters of DSM-3, who included a psychiatrist named Robert Spitzer, who was very important to this whole process, wrote a preface to the DSM-3 that claimed that psychiatric disorders were a subset of medical disorders. The psychologists objected. There was discussion back and forth. Ultimately, that was withdrawn. A chapter on childhood and adolescent disorders was created. There was a lot of criticism of this as well, because the claim was that, the claim was that the drafters of DSM-3 had created a number of disorders that nobody thought were psychiatric disorders. Things like stuttering, like arithmetic and reading disorders, and a whole variety of other disorders that had never before been considered worthy of diagnosis. And the drafters of DSM-3, Robert Spitzer and colleagues, said, we want to include in the DSM-3 all disorders that require some attention from mental health professionals, not necessarily medication or not even necessarily treatment. There were a number of other things that were done to increase the reliability of the DSM, including from field trials that were instituted coincident with DSM-3, a lot of data on incidence and prevalence of these disorders, including a lot of data on the symptoms that constituted various diagnostic labels. So operational criteria, that's another phrase for symptoms. The decision rules in the DSM were designed to give instructions to the clinician that was using the symptoms, and so that clinicians would apply these symptoms in a consistent way to increase reliability. And that's in fact what did happen. So that The reliability of diagnoses was very much improved. Unfortunately, the usefulness of diagnosis from DSM-3 wasn't changed very much, so that something called the multi-axial system for each diagnosis was used in DSM-3 to provide clinicians much more information on patients, including their degree of disability, associated medical problems that might have contributed to the diagnosis. Now, one of the most notable things about DSM-3 is that there was a much more diverse group of clinicians, including a good number more of women, people of color, and non-psychiatrists, psychologists, and social workers. So as a result, the group that put together DSM-3 was much more reflective of the diversity of the US population. There was a revision of DSM-3, DSM-3R, which was a pretty thorough revision. So the text of the nomenclature, that is the text that talked about differential diagnosis, treatment, etiology, associated conditions, a lot of information that before this time had been included really mostly in psychiatric textbooks. Was the revision of this text was included in the DSM-3R. Some of the operational criteria, the symptoms, were also changed. So this was a pretty thorough revision. DSM-4 maintained the number of diagnoses, even though many people had encouraged the drafters of DSM-4 to reduce the number of diagnoses. But there were some additions and some deletions, but the number stayed about the same, and that disappointed a lot of people who hoped that there would be a decrease in the number of diagnoses. There were an even larger number of field trials connected to DSM-4, so data on incidence and prevalence and on symptoms and decision rules were much more in evidence. This was to a much greater degree. The DSM-4 was evidence-based rather than armchair-based. A 5-volume set of books that were written by members of the diagnostic work groups so that future researchers and clinicians understood what had gone on in the creation of this nomenclature. Conscious effort was made to limit new diagnoses in the belief that DSM already included an overabundance of diagnoses. The developers of DSM-4 were even more diverse than had been the developers of DSM-3. There was a DSM-4TR text revision so that the text surrounding the diagnostic syndromes was brought up to date as a result of new research on epidemiology, etiology, and treatment. There were no changes made in operational criteria. This was published in 2000. And that brings us up to DSM-5, an interesting set of events occurring. The new edition of the DSM-5, has been widely criticized in several books, countless articles, op-ed pieces in prominent newspapers. It's been reviewed by a number of professional groups, and the criticism has been pretty intense. One of the most critical books, interestingly, was written by Alan Francis, who was the task force chair of the DSM-4 effort. And he wrote a scathing book criticizing the DSM-5 for overdiagnosis, undue influence on the diagnostic process by large drug companies, overpromising the development of biomarkers, and dimensional diagnosis. Let me talk about what those things are. Overdiagnosis was the old familiar criticism that began in DSM-3 with the huge increase in the number of diagnoses. Many clinicians, psychologists, psychiatrists, social workers, and psychiatric nurses criticized the DSM, including the DSM-5, for being willing to present diagnoses that identified conditions that many people felt didn't really represent psychiatric disorder. Now, why did this occur? Well, Francis and quite a number of others felt that it was because the diagnostic process was influenced strongly by the large drug companies that made psychiatric medication. He called it big pharma. And it stands to reason that if there's a dramatic increase in the number of diagnoses, there will be also quite an increase in the number of and kind of medications that clinicians can use to treat this new set of diagnoses. So that was the rationale for Francis's criticism about overdiagnosis. And the drafters of DSM-5 were criticized for overpromising the development of biomarkers and dimensional diagnosis. What does that mean? That means that at the beginning of the process of revising DSM-4, putting together the work group and the task work groups and the task forces, the associate chair of the task force promised that by the end of the process, there would have been the development of a large number of so-called biomarkers. Biomarkers are largely at this point imaging measures of brain function believed to be associated with a range of most important psychiatric disorders. So the assumption was if you gave a variety of structural and functional imaging devices to patients, there would be a characteristic set of patterns that would signal a particular disorder. Now, we're already moving in that direction. For example, the substance use disorders and the addictive disorders show a reinforcement pattern in the brain, in the limbic system, that's responsible for the reinforcement associated with substances and with gambling. So that's interesting, and that was believed to be a very important development, so that clinicians would move from relying on symptoms, which are often unreliable, to relying on biomarkers. Then finally, dimensional diagnosis had been in the works for a number of years, in large part because, for example, personality disorders, which were discrete categories of disorder, like antisocial personality, schizotypal personality, and so on, um, were almost always overlapping. So that patients typically, especially patients suffering from substance use disorders, um, might emerge from the diagnostic process with 3 or 4 different personality disorders diagnoses, with diagnosis of substance abuse or dependence, and with perhaps a couple of diagnoses in the depressive or anxious realm. So the dimensional diagnosis effort was to reduce or eliminate the discrete uh, labels like substance abuse, substance dependence, and instead to have a continuum of severity, which didn't call upon clinicians to make a decision about a label. Same thing went for the subtypes of schizophrenia, uh, which were removed from the nomenclature after perhaps 100 years of use. Abuse and dependence to substances were eliminated. Again, this was because they could not be given reliably because they didn't provide enough information to be used. So the DSM-5 essentially has maintained the number of diagnoses included in DSM-4, for which the task force chairs have been thoroughly criticized. It's eliminated the multi-axial system, which was introduced in DSM-3 and continued in DSM-4 as a way of dealing with the usefulness of the diagnostic system. The problem was a number of the judgments to be made in the multi-axial system could not be made reliably, particularly decisions about how disabled individuals were, what their prognosis might have been. The separate chapter on childhood and adult disorders was removed, and those disorders were put into the symptom chapters in order to give a broad-based lifespan development view of these disorders. So we'll see as we move along what we have. Okay. I'm having a problem changing the okay. Okay, so again, what we're left with is a system that's reliable but has so many different diagnoses that it's difficult, it's cumbersome to use. So what's happened? What are the big changes? Well, we talked about the removal of the childhood chapter, but let's talk about this. The chapters have been rearranged in DSM-5 to reflect a lifespan developmental approach. And why was that done? Well, above all, it was done to bring the DSM into closer conformity to the developing ICD-11. That's the ultimate goal. So that the disorders that were most frequently diagnosed in childhood are included at the beginning of the manual. The neurodevelopmental disorders, including intellectual disability, and a new construct called the autism spectrum disorders, that continuum. That includes things like schizotypal behavior, um, autism itself, and a variety of other disorders or conditions that appear to be similar to autism. There's a spectrum, meaning a continuum. There's also a schizophrenia spectrum disorder and related disorders. Again, these occur in childhood, and the dimensionalization of schizophrenia, autism was accomplished by means of a continuum, which I'll show you a little later. Diagnoses that were most common in adolescence and young adulthood were in the middle of the manual: bipolar disorder, depressive continuum, anxiety disorder continuum, and then finally, disorders of adulthood and later life were included at the end of the manual: substance-related disorders, neurocognitive disorders. Now, neurocognitive disorders, that's a new term. That replaces kind of a cumbersome term, delirium, dementia, and the amnestic disorders. The problem was that had become very stigmatic. It was a stigma to see that word dementia in a diagnosis. It included Alzheimer's disease, Korsakoff's psychosis, and other deliria and dementia. So that term, neurocognitive disorders, was assumed to be less stigmatizing to patients. Now, in 20 or 30 years, it'll probably be as stigmatizing as the former label was, and they'll have to find a new one. But suffice it to say that now that group of disorders, which typically occur in later life, are called the neurocognitive disorders. Now, other changes: the DSM-3, DSM-4 include independent chapters on disorders usually first diagnosed in infancy, childhood, or adolescence. DSM-5 doesn't include that chapter. Instead, those disorders have been moved to the beginning of chapters that focus on disorders of infancy, childhood, and adolescence. So that's an effort to create a continuum from infancy through childhood, adolescence, young adulthood, old age. And that is characteristic of of all of the chapters in the DSM-5. The DSM-3 and the DSM-4 included the multi-axial diagnostic system, the global assessment of functioning scale, which was axis 5 and permitted clinicians to make a judgment about the seriousness of impairment of patients they were diagnosing. The problem was that couldn't be done, or wasn't done very reliably, and so it didn't really have the value that clinicians who drafted DSM-3 and DSM-4 thought it might have. So there's a combination of the axes, DSM-5, to try to permit clinicians to make some of the same judgments. I don't predict it will be terribly widely used. And again, this diagnostic system changes. DSM-3 and DSM-4 emphasize discrete diagnostic categories. Does the client meet, or the patient meet, the criteria for, or the symptoms for alcohol abuse, for alcohol dependence, or is the person using but not using to excess? DSM-5 emphasizes dimensional assessment, so the judgment about substances has moved to mild substance use disorder, moderate substance use disorder, severe substance use disorder on the basis of the number of symptoms observed in the patient. So now I want to use substance-related and addictive disorders. I don't think we'll have time for the neurocognitive disorders, to illustrate how DSM-5 is to be used. Now, you'll notice the substance-related and addictive disorders chapter includes something called addictive disorders. And in this case, the drafters of the people who worked on the work group for substance-related and addictive disorders decided to include one non-substance related disorder, gambling disorder. Now, how is that possible that substance use disorders, there are a lot of them, and a non-substance use disorder, gambling disorder, would be included in the same chapter? That's because, interestingly enough, a good deal of research has indicated that gambling disorders have similar symptoms to substance use disorders. They have a similar pattern of etiology of development, beginning just about the same time in life. And their treatment is often very similar, and they share the kinds of brain reward structures, very interesting and very surprising in some sense. But that may grow in time to include other non-substance use disorders. So the DSM-5 chapter on substance-related and addictive disorders includes all of these conditions and all of these substances. And for almost all of them, the clinician is called upon to diagnose the substance use disorder and to comment on or diagnose substance intoxication, substance withdrawal. And for most of the substances, they are to be rated mild, moderate, or severe on the basis of the number of symptoms observed. There are a few exceptions to the general rule that things like intoxication, withdrawal are included in almost all the substance use disorders, but the hallucinogens do not show intoxication, withdrawal, and inhalant use, tobacco use, no intoxication, caffeine use, no severity ratings. Although there's a lot of controversy about that. But let's move to the alcohol use disorders and illustrate this whole chapter, the substance use disorders, with a single substance, the one that you're probably most familiar with. Alcohol use disorder, mild, moderate, severe, alcohol intoxication, alcohol withdrawal. This is the diagnostic continuum. Mild alcohol use, 2 or 3 of the symptoms, there are 11 symptoms in all, also called operational criteria. Moderate alcohol use disorder, 4 or 5 symptoms. Severe alcohol use disorder, 6 or more symptoms. Generally, individuals diagnosed with a mild alcohol use disorder will be watched and observed, but probably will not be offered treatment. Moderate alcohol use disorder, many of these patients will be offered treatment, probably not inpatient treatment. Those with severe alcohol use disorder, 6 or more symptoms, will probably be institutionalized if they agree to that and treated in an institution. Now, the overall substance use disorder description, so you can substitute opiate use disorder, marijuana use disorder, sedative hypnotic use disorder, and so on, is a problematic pattern of alcohol use. That means that the use of alcohol in this instance causes problems. The use of heroin, if this is a heroin use disorder, causes problems. And these problems lead to clinically significant impairment or distress. And in this case, at least 2 of 11 symptoms, and they have to occur within a 12-month period. These are decision rules that the clinicians who are looking at patients with alcohol use disorder will follow. So these are the symptoms or the operational criteria for alcohol use disorder. Often taking alcohol in larger amounts or over a longer period than intended. This is a common complaint of students, including students at the University of Iowa. Even when I go out to a bar or a party, having resolved to drink no more than 3 beers or spend no more than 2 hours, by the end of the evening, I discovered I've consumed 10 beers over 4 hours. A persistent desire or unsuccessful efforts to cut down or control alcohol use. Time and again, I've tried to control my drinking, but I've never been able to do so. This is one of the most common and important operational criteria. Spending a great deal of time in activities necessary to obtain alcohol, use alcohol, recover from its effects. Alcohol takes up a lot of time in my life. What with getting the money to buy it, spending time at bars consuming it, talking to friends, and then getting over whatever hangover I might have developed from my drinking. Actually, substances like the opiates and heroin are the ones that really require a great deal of time to be spent because they have to be prepared. First, they have to be gotten. People have to have the money to buy them. They have to be prepared for injection, and then they have to be injected, and then there is a period of time to withdraw from the heroin. So they require, and that's really why this diagnostic criterion was included. Craving or a strong desire or urge to use alcohol. This is the one new symptom. It replaces a symptom that says using alcohol will get you into trouble with the criminal justice system. The problem with that is that a single DWI will probably not get you in trouble with criminal justice system, but more than that will. But craving is a very common consequence of moderate and severe use of alcohol and other substances. When I haven't been drinking for a day or two, I'll begin to experience strong craving for alcohol, and it stays with me until I take a drink to get rid of the craving. That's the beginnings of withdrawal, and people will drink to avoid withdrawal. Recurrent alcohol use resulting in a failure to fulfill major role obligations at work, school, or home. A common complaint. It will sometimes happen that my drinking makes it impossible for me to go to work or take care of my family. This makes me feel terrible, but I still do it. Why is that? And clinicians find it very difficult to answer that question. Why, in fact, do substance abusers or moderate severe substance use disorder clients continue to use when it gets them into so much trouble? That's a very important question. Continued alcohol use despite having persistent or recurrent social or interpersonal problems caused or exacerbated by the effects of alcohol. Even though I have a tendency to become angry and sometimes violent, when I've been drinking, I continue to drink and then to suffer the consequences of my anger and my fights. Important social, occupational, or recreational activities are given up or reduced because of the use of alcohol. I used to like to dance, visit with my friends and family, but since I've started to drink so much, I've given up almost everything that doesn't involve drinking. Recurrent alcohol use in situations in which it is physically hazardous. Obviously, the DWI example is most relevant. There was a woman in Maine who had accumulated 35 DWIs. It's really hard to believe. She'd been imprisoned because of that. She's had all kinds of sanctions. And again, she said, I can't stop drinking and driving. So she would, most of the time, drive without a license, be arrested, be tried, put in jail, but she'd continue. It's an extraordinary record. Alcohol use has continued despite knowledge of having a persistent or recurrent physical or psychological problem that's likely to have been caused or exacerbated by alcohol. It says, even though I almost always get depressed after I've been drinking for some time, I continue to drink. I don't know why. It doesn't make sense to me. And then there are tolerance and withdrawal criteria. And these are important criteria. Tolerance is a function of moderate and severe substance use, so that the individual who's using to that extent generally has to markedly increase the amounts of the substance, in this case alcohol, to achieve intoxication and the desired effect. Or the person will experience a markedly diminished effect if they don't increase the use, in this case, of alcohol. There is a characteristic difference in tolerance among the substances to which people become addicted. The sedative hypnotic drugs, which include the barbiturates, benzodiazepines, and a variety of other substances that are typically used to induce sleep, dramatically increase tolerance over relatively short periods of time. So a client who begins using, let's say, phenobarbital, after 2 weeks will have developed a very serious dependence, tolerance, will have had to increase the amount of the drug ingested by many, many times. And as a result, withdrawal from these substances like phenobarbital, other barbiturates, benzodiazepines, will have become life-threatening. So patients who are severely dependent on certain substances, like these sedatives, have to be withdrawn in an institutional setting, like a hospital, rather than on the street or in a jail. Alcohol sort of falls midway between those with less tolerance and more tolerance. Um, and as a result, the withdrawal is not as bad. There is, however, a syndrome associated with alcohol withdrawal that is serious and does require treatment, and that is delirium tremens. So if an individual has consumed enough alcohol over a long enough period of time to develop DTs, and a relatively small group of people do, they have to be treated because there's an untreated risk of death in the face of delirium tremens of 10 to 15%. And I think we're getting very close to where we need to stop. And I think I will stop at this point and see whether there are questions or comments. And I think, Kate, you're going to handle that.
Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Nathan. If you have questions at this time, please submit them in the Q&A pod, which is just to the right of the presentation. And I'll just take a second to remind everyone while we're waiting for questions to come in. We will be sending out follow-up emails to everyone who registered. For those who attended, you'll get a link to the recording of this webinar, as well as a link to the survey in case you don't make it to the survey when we close out. And we'll also have handouts available on that email and a CEH request. It doesn't look like we have any questions now. Did you want to take, oh, looks like we just got a couple in, okay. I have a question here from Lisa. Why is the diagnosis code the same for moderate and severe?
Why is it mild, moderate, and severe, or severe?
Sorry, why is the diagnosis code the same for moderate and severe?
Well, the reason these specifiers are included is because they bear a relationship to treatment. Patients with severe substance use disorders will almost always be in treatment, and that treatment will often include inpatient treatment. Individuals with moderate substance use disorders will be often in treatment, but they may not be institutionalized. And individuals with a mild substance use disorder will be hopefully carefully monitored, but will not necessarily receive treatment. So there are uses to which these are put. They're very similar to the substance abuse and substance dependence specifiers, but they can be made more reliably so that clinicians can agree to a greater extent on them.
Thank you. We have another question from Stephen. Can I use 296.99 disruptive mood disorder to diagnose for long-standing grief or loss or bereavement disorder? In Indian country, this seems to be a big issue.
Kate, could you say that again?
Yes. Can I use 296.99 disruptive mood disorder to diagnose for long-standing grief and loss or bereavement disorder? In Indian country, this seems to be a big issue.
Okay. Can I use let's see. Why is the diagnosis the same for moderate and severe? Okay. Can I use disruptive mood disorder to diagnose for long-standing grief, loss, or bereavement disorder? In Indian country, this seems to be a big issue. I agree with that, and I also agree that the DSM-5 is not necessarily very useful in some cases in Indian country because it does not include For example, in this case, historic trauma. There's been an effort on the part of Native Americans to create a diagnostic system or to alter this one to bring it into more closer conformity to the experiences of Native Americans. That's the sort of best I can say, but I would say disruptive mood disorder is probably not very helpful in identifying long-standing grief, loss, or bereavement as a function of historic trauma.
Thank you, Dr. Nathan. And I've got one more question. We'll just take this last question before we close out. This question is from Sherry, and she asks, so moderate and severe specify the diagnosis, but it is up to the clinician to report the criteria that would be outpatient or inpatient?
Yeah, I think that's right. They're actually moderate and severe and mild do have separate diagnostic codes, but it's up to the clinician to assess the criteria to determine whether the individual ought to be in inpatient or outpatient treatment. Of course, it depends too on the substance abused. If the person is heavily dependent on heroin, methamphetamine, other opiates, oxycodone, chances are inpatient treatment will be required, and that'll be the decision of the clinician. Good question.
Wonderful. Well, I want to take a moment to thank Dr. Nathan. This has been a very informative session, and a couple people mentioned or an interest in another DSM webinar. So I will be sure, and please, if others are interested in that, if people have any specific topics that they'd like to cover, we'd love to hear from that. And if people are interested in more about the DSM-5 specifically, please let me know, and I will be sure to invite Dr. Nathan to join us again. He's been a wonderful presenter for us, and I'd love to have the opportunity to have him share more. So with that, I will just remind everyone to look for the email that will be coming to you, and also hopefully you'll get a chance to take our GIPRA survey as we close out. So please take a few moments and let us know what you thought of today's session. And with that, I want to thank Dr. Nathan again for joining us and for sharing his particular expertise with us. And Dr. Nathan, did you have any final thoughts you'd like to share?
No, I've provided you an awful lot of information, and if you don't remember it all, I understand, we understand. But when you receive the handouts, go over them carefully, and you'll learn a good deal. The other thing is you can certainly follow up with me if you have questions I can respond to. And that my email is peter-nathan@uiowa.edu.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Nathan, and feel free to get in touch with me to respond to one of my emails about this webinar as well, and I can always pass things on to Dr. Nathan too. And with that, we just want to thank everyone for joining us, and we hope you have a great day.